First of all, what do I know? American Civil War. So, 14 colonies, they said, fuck you, Britain. So they fucked them up, made their own nation. They started doing shit. And in the South, there was a lot of cotton. A lot of cotton fields, man. And these cotton people, they needed slaves, man, for their industry, man. That's why there was more slaves in the South, because that's where all the fucking cotton and shit was. In the North, there was less industry like that. That's why they didn't have so many slaves. Even though the first slave in America was the Dutch, the British, the Dutch. The Dutch brought that over. Then the North was a bit like, slavery, not so cool. But the South is like, man, I need slaves for my fucking money, man. I gotta make money, man. And then in the end, they fight over that shit. And there was a guy called Robert E. Lee. And there was a guy called Ulysses S. Grant. And they all shot each other. And then Abe Lincoln won. And black people never had any problems anymore. Right?
Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor...
Once again, before we get into this, man, dude, what's better? Do you want to listen to a boring teacher teaching you the American Civil War for 45 minutes, or do you want to watch this video where a guy actually teaches to you in a modern, animated way, right? This is the history of education, man. I will even go as far as saying that.
Kentucky, eventually moving to Indiana, and finally, Illinois. He read
Around
lot
3
of books,
years.
Worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and finally...
Wait, what do you read?
Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a
Nicolas Cage impersonator.
lot of jobs, wrote some questionable...
It's an actual poem. Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen, I wrote the same. I wrote in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read. That actually is genius. This is kind of like, if you read this, you're dumb. This is fucking trolling. He's like, if you read this, you're a fool.
Poetry.
Damn.
And finally,
You just
entered
fucking
the
dissed
law
me.
profession. Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case, a guy claimed he witnessed a murder at night, and Lincoln was like, how could you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon. A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night, which makes you a liar.
Better Call Saul, baby.
Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal. Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only
Man, he looked like he went through a lot of fucking shit, man.
interested in law, however. He also dabbled in the world.
Do you guys know what his nationality was? Like, where his, what immigration parents he had? Like, what his...
Of politics,
You guys know?
serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies.
Let's actually just Google. I don't trust you guys. He was descendant of Samuel Lincoln, an Englishman. English, okay. English, pretty much.
And
Sure.
what a time it was. Not even 100 years after the founding fathers wrote, all men are created equal. Politicians were
Except if they have a different color. And except if they don't have a penis.
already asking, yeah, but what does that mean exactly? It means all men. Yeah, but what does that mean exactly? And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The founding fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation. And the big
Is cereal a soup? Dude, they have a commercial now?
founding fathers
Right
left
down the
some of these
street?
questions
They have a
perhaps little
commercial?
too
I don't know
open
what with him. That guy's right down the street, man. I was so impressed, man. The meme, the grandpa, he's actually Hungarian. You guys know that? He's in my street now.
to interpretation. And the biggest question of them all was slavery, an ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of
Yeah, you can see this document in real life if we go to New York, right? This is where Nicolas Cage stole that shit, right?
slavery in the Declaration
You can actually
of
see this in real
Independence.
life,
But out
right?
of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys, do you
In
think
Washington,
leaving this
in
a little
Washington.
vague will create any
Oh.
unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged.
Damn, the South
Northern
was so
cities
big.
began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large plantations of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode. While in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South, as Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance. a happy medium, a harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation.
I always feel like what an interesting time it must have been to go west here. Like, it must have been so interesting. Like, you're an immigrant and you arrive and you're like, I'm going west looking for my fortune. It must have been a very exciting time.
We'll be happy to accept you as a free state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's going to be a slave state. Okay, listen. Why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants
Dies
to
of
be,
dysentery. Killing Indians.
Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene. Maine. Hey, you can't do that. You can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. You see, as America expanded westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. It could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population feeling spiteful and oppressed. For a while, compromises kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything as usual. The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into a war with Mexico, which they won, gaining a huge amount of land.
I know nothing about this. Dude, like years ago, I was playing EU4 or something. I'm like, why the fuck is Mexico in West America, man? I never knew about this. I never knew that Mexico was up there.
Problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen. Why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state? Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that. And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again.
Scary shit, though, man. Another great movie, right, that won a lot of Oscars is 12 Years a Slave, right? And I think that was based on a true story. Yeah, I'm very, very sure that was based on a true story. There was a black man living in a free state, I think, I don't know, in the Northeast he was living, and two people kidnapped him, took him to the South, and he had like a life and everything, and a family, and they just took him, brought him south, made him a fucking slave. Imagine that shit, right? Imagine someone just takes you right now out of your life and enslaves you. Like, fuck, man, that is some vile, evil shit, dude.
A few years later, it came up again. In
Solomon
1854,
Northrop
a
is his
Democratic
name.
senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be created open to slavery, even though they were clearly...
That actually still happens nowadays all the time, right? A lot of mafia just steals Eastern European women and enslaves them, makes them drug addicted and uses them as prostitutes, right?
Above
Happens
the Missouri
still
Compromise
all the
line.
time, dude.
Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery should be legal or not. And so it was. Huge numbers of pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote in their favor. And while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other. One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried and went arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his life to the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery.
The first Antifa guy.
The tension began to grow at a rapid pace. In 1852, author Harriet Beecher Stowe penned Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the terrible cruelty of slavery to the world. Oh, how often.
That must have been also a big thing back then, that most people didn't know how fucking vile it was. Like, the whole world probably didn't know what the fuck really is going on there, right? But man, what these slave people had to go through, man, must have been unbelievable, unimaginable. Like, that is so dehumanizing, and this is just... How many years ago? 200 years ago, man? Crazy.
Things to happen. Your Majesty, what should we do about all the starving children working in the coal mines? Nothing! In 1854, the Republican Party was formed, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leading figure.
Back when Republicans actually
Republican Party
had some good ideas.
Mistrust,
160 years,
radical
man.
and abolitionist. In 1856, a politician named Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress, calling out slave-owning Democrats with fiery language. If slavery was a woman, she'd be an ugly one, and the senator from South Carolina would like to boink her. Representative Brooks, do you have a rebuttal? Oh, I have a rebuttal, all right. Yeah, here's a rebuttal for you.
This is what
Come
the
on,
Lincoln
surely
movie
this isn't allowed.
Daniel Day-Lewis is
I
about a
don't
bit,
know.
about
I'll have to
these,
consult the rulebook.
how they talk about this stuff in Congress.
I can't find anything about caning a political opponent, but it says here I'm not allowed to wear women's underwear. Uh-oh. News of the violence on the Senate floor took the nation by storm. Southern slave owners sent Representative Brooks new canes to replace his now broken one. And on the floors of Congress, politicians carried weapons in self-defense, which is
that's so
never a good
American.
sign. In 1857, the Supreme Court...
Did you realize that Democrats were actually for slavery and Republicans were for ending slavery? And today, Democrats with their agenda play on angels. That's really dumb to think like this. This is 150 years ago. You know, things change, people change, and obviously political parties change. It's very, very whataboutism to walk around. The Democrats, 150 years ago, you wanted slavery, so you can't be trusted nowadays. Childish way of thinking.
Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any circumstance. Within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children
the
were
Utopia
stolen
achievements right
from
now,
their
bro.
homelands
Thank you for sub.
and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty.
That's
and work
crazy,
from
right?
sunrise
I very, very often look at the human race through the eyes of an alien. Sounds weird. You're going to be like, what the fuck are you talking about, Tommy? But I always look at the human race. Imagine an intelligent alien that has overcome all the bullshit. No religion, no envy, no greed, like a really intelligent being. And it looks at Earth and it watches us. And then you see something like slavery, man. Like I sometimes feel like an alien looks at us and like runs away in terror, man. Because we are fucking terrifying beings, we humans, man. The stuff we do to each other is fucking crazy.
Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary.
Yeah, these overseers, man, like the real fucking Gestapo.
Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often
Insane,
only watch
bro.
as their children
Imagine
were
that,
off,
man.
never to be seen again.
I think something we're missing nowadays in this society is that no one has empathy anymore. No one can imagine things anymore, man. Like, imagine going through this, man. Imagine going through this, dude. That is... Holy fuck,
Thousands of
dude.
slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad as bounty hunters entered the North to chase them down. Leading figures within the abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women. But it's important to note that for many of the anti-slavery white individuals in the North, opposition to slavery was often an economic issue, not a moral one, as many worried large plantations would take their lands and livelihoods away.
I read that a lot about the American Civil War or slavery wasn't about human rights and wasn't about let's help these black people. It was about money, because these plantation owners were wrecking the economy and they were just doing so well with these slaves, right?
Abraham
in its
Lincoln
core,
knew
man,
that
it was a lot
slavery
about
was
money
moral
and not about
evil,
human
and
rights.
He regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children.
4 million.
He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day slavery in America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859, one abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by force.
Is this a crazy guy?
Enough to
It
even
is.
attempt such a thing. It's our good friend, John Brown. He planned to seize arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way. A noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marines. Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like,
What a
"You
life
see
John
this?
Brown had, man.
They're
Jesus.
coming for us. Soon,
That
there'll be
fucking
a
dude,
million
eh?
John Browns. A million John Browns?
600,000 people died in the
What
Civil
on
War,
earth
man.
are you
Imagine
thinking
that.
about? The John Brown
Fucking hell.
farm? Yeah, me too. To make matters worse, new northern free states meant now the southern states really were outnumbered.
That's an
and they
event
were
in Victoria
beginning to
too?
feel
John
bitterly
Brown's last
spiteful
raid.
and oppressed. Further fear began to spread in
learning
the
so
South
much
when
lately,
news
dude.
broke that a relatively unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination for president. Abraham Lincoln, mostly well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he and his cheekbones could become president. For the South, that would be too much. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states.
Oh.
But much to their horror, when the final
Not
result
the last time America's gonna have rigged elections. Am I right? Show the emails! Show the emails!
came in,
Stop the count!
Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide.
Nice.
Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell
Lincoln
you?
was an insane wrestler? Whoa, what the fuck? Dude. During Abraham Lincoln's final year in Springfield, Illinois in 1960, before he was elected America's president, folks would sometimes observe him in shirt sleeves, engaged in a fast-paced game of fives with other young men. Holy crap, that's amazing.
Take away your
Interesting,
slaves.
man. He was a wrestler.
Yeah, right, honest
Crazy.
Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not? Well, if
Thank
you
you,
had
Dirk, my
won the
brother.
election, would it be
Thank you,
okay
thank
for
you.
us to leave? Of course not. Well, why?
Yeah, Vin, we're not talking about the WWE SmackDown Raw, okay? We're not talking about that right now.
Not. Because
Yes.
that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation. And now, with
To me, as a European, you Americans still feel like that. I mean, nah, you guys are very patriotic. You love your country, America, but you guys are also very patriotic to your states. That
the
really
South
comes
feeling
across.
like it had lost its voice in the
when you see
federal government,
Americans.
they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union, with just 4 contested border states opting to remain. The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government
Could you imagine a world where these two states would have coexisted for like hundreds of
illegitimate.
years?
Mississippi declared that their position
being
was
loyal to
thoroughly
Wyoming.
identified with the institution of slavery. And in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality. Revered American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one New York lawyer wrote that rather than a bold eagle, America's national bird should be a debilitated chicken. And hey, I kind of like that. One
That
man,
makes a lot of sense,
watching
yeah.
the crisis unfold, knew it would be his job to solve it. Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. Hey man, you're hella ugly. Grow a beard or something to hide that face. Good idea.
Happened to me too.
Eh,
He even has the fucking Khabib Nurmagomedov beard from fucking Dagestan. No wonder he's a good wrestler.
still ugly. With assassination plots already underway, Lincoln had to travel to Washington, D.C.
Oh, they
under
tried
heavy
to
disguise
assassinate him?
and protection. All along the way, he received stacks of threatening letters. May the hand of the devil strike you down. You are destroying this country.
That girl actually has a
Damn
statue
you,
now.
Every breath you take, love from Grandma. At his inauguration speech, Lincoln once again reiterated that no, I do not want to take away anyone's slaves. But for Lincoln, he did want to preserve the Union. He declared secession to be nothing but an illegitimate rebellion. In your hands and not in mine, he said, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors.
What a man though, right? What a
We are not
legacy, man.
enemies, but
What a
friends.
big historical
It was
figure.
clear-
And dude, sorry Americans, but I think you know it yourself. You guys used to have amazing fucking historical characters in your country. And now you guys have Trump and Biden, Alter.
Lincoln was ready and
That is
willing to get
ridiculous,
freaky
dude.
and open up a can of Scatman John if he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however, was in question. In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot. As they seceded, the Confederate states began seizing federal U.S. property throughout the South.
Don't
Off the coast
remind
in
me.
Charleston, South Carolina, was one such federal property, Fort Sumter, held by a measly, undersupplied U.S. force. The Confederate militia there demanded the fort surrender, a request which was quickly denied, and any remaining hope for a peaceful solution to the secession
Must have actually soldiers to kill their own brothers, their own American brothers, man.
crisis probably then died when the Confederates did this. The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the American Civil War. Many of the Confederates there also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped Old Abe would just sigh and say, okay, you win.
No.
Unfortunately for
He
them,
ain't doing that
Lincoln
shit.
actually said, you're about to get a roundhouse to the face. Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000 volunteers, and men signed up in droves, hopeful for some adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for 100,000 men. As ever, both sides hoped for a quick end to the war. Is it over yet? No, Jimmy, it's been 1 week. Is it over now? No.
600,000
How
deaths,
about
man.
now?
Fuck.
If you ask that one more time, I swear I will turn this army around and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children.
I started a massive discussion in chat. Woohoo! How good Biden is.
But in particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million. Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan. Hit me. We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings. Crossing the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas. And you? Wrong video. Hey, I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that, dingus. Eventually, Lincoln's generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a
It's the bloodiest war America has fought.
blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the Great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the East would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war. Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the East began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in DC had sent a coded message to the Confederates warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the heck is NordVPN?
Good one.
Union invasion
This century was the biggest killer in the Civil War.
into Virginia. The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal.
Sometimes I wonder about soldiers that fight for a seemingly bad cause. Don't you stand on the battlefield and feel like, wait, I'm fighting for slavery? I'm fighting for black people being fucking treated like animals? Like, I feel like this with Russians. Like, Russians driving to Ukraine right now. I'm fighting for my country, right? And the motherland. Am I though? But what am I fighting for? Like, dude. I mean, you probably don't really have a choice, right?
In numbers.
And brainwashing,
However,
a lot of
they were
brainwashing.
also equally
Propaganda and
inexperienced.
brainwashing.
A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement on
No fucking way.
full. Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates
Yeah,
on
they
their
probably
left,
didn't know
and
how
the two
crazy this
sides
all was.
fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named Wilmer McLean. Hurry up, Martha! There's a war out here! The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go! The Union force saw initial success pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill, but one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union army off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C.
I remember that
With
from the
heavy
movie. They lost their
casualties,
first fight.
The sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle.
And man, if you look at history, man, a lot of wars when they start, what I always want to say is, you and me, we are the future. We already know how everything turns out, right? But if you look at a lot of war during history, like Ukraine and Russia, oftentimes both sides don't even know what the fuck's going to happen. They don't even know how escalated everything is going to go, right? That's something we should, as we look back at history, should always contemplate in our brains, that they had very, very different information than us, right? And we, especially you, Chad, you often, they should have done this, they should have done that, but they had very different information back then, right?
Had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson
knows
whipped
better,
us
though.
so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait,
I heard
that's
that
why they're
before,
calling him
Stonewall
that?
Jackson.
Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall? Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first major battle out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially
And in these scenarios, man, getting fucked like this, staying strong, like Zelensky stayed strong when they were in front of Kiev, man, that makes a real fucking leader, man. Staying strong in these dire
many of his
times,
generals
man.
and cabinet already didn't have much respect for him. They felt he was incapable of running a war because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife is missing me. but her aim is starting to improve. But deep down,
Yeah, he's known for
realized
making
he
jokes
could
like
also
this.
be incredibly
That's also in the movie.
Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how?
What do you mean funny? I
Funny
amuse
like
you?
I'm a clown?
Like I'm a clown? I amuse you?
No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war,
so goddamn
Lincoln
funny
committed
about me.
acts that were viewed by some as impeachable.
If you didn't get that reference, kids, it's time to watch some movies. What movie? Daniel Day-Lewis fucking Lincoln dude, you know?
His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. By the end of 1861, with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men.
And Russian and Zelensky, oh, be careful, man. They might knock you in your door in a
about
second.
emancipation. Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation.
Zelensky is also a
I
high.
don't want to ruffle any feathers. The
He should rename Kiev into Ablada Fry.
feathers
Good
are
one.
already
Good
ruffled.
one, good one,
But
good
Lincoln,
one. I know.
hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and supply
You
lines.
escape slavery
Hoping to
and then
get
they're
things
like,
moving, Lincoln
ah,
made
you're
young
fucked.
General George McClellan the new commanding general.
Everybody
and
was so good
McClellan
back then,
began
man.
to train up his men. He thought a lot of
But young guys look like this again. Like if you go to university nowadays, like law school, they look like this again.
himself, however.
They have these
and
beards
believed he
again
was going
and
to
the
be the
haircut.
nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve of the president's handling of the war. On one occasion, Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed. Now that's what I call disrespectful.
That's some
McClellan
disrespect,
talked
bruh.
the talk, but could he walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively. What if they have like 10,000 men? Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40. Okay, you can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain.
Thank you, dude,
McClellan
man.
would not make a move
Thank you,
for
man.
the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee. General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big
became
fan
president
of
later, right?
whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname, sir."
He's on the $50 bill? Yeah, really?
The Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms. No terms, just unconditional surrender. Hey, unconditional surrender Grant. That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys? Right? Later in April
died in
1862, the
poverty?
Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far, and despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched as his
There's
cabinet did
$500
nothing but
bills?
bicker, and his generals
Franklin
did
is
nothing.
Franklin
But
is
then,
100.
Worst of all, personal tragedy
Belframe.
struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility.
That's what I just said, man. That's what a real man... Dude, let's real talk for 1 second. That's... The man loses his fucking kid in the craziest war this nation has ever seen. And he stays strong and steers this ship, man.
And his family.
We gotta put respect on this, learn from them, and apply their teachings to our lives. What it means to be a real man. To steer straight in the darkest of times and to not give up and to not pussy out and to not fucking cry about it, man.
Together.
That's what it
and
fucking
by doing
means.
so, he hoped to hold the nation together. And he had it with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln decided he was gonna take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to some of McClellan's men to defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley. and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed
Shenandoah Valley, Shenandoah River, Virginia, yeah.
the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, but it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond, his armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly and defensively, and with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President, no need. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time.
Dude, he looks kind of sexy. That's a sexy looking man, dude. Look at that beard. I want to have that beard.
Was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed.
Jesus.
Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans. And speaking of the navy, both sides had begun using
such a beautiful
ironclads.
city, man.
So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run,
They're almost
in which
Washington,
nearby
bro.
farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha! There's another war out here! I'm waiting for my hair to dry! Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the war would definitely, absolutely, never touch him again. But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion
the French
to the
blocked
war.
that shit, I remember,
The tension
right?
between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to
The
win.
Confederates invented
Lincoln
the first
needed
submarine.
something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical
Interesting,
as
right? You always paint him like a hero that wanted to end slavery, but in the end, ending slavery was just a means.
emancipation,
It was just a
they
means,
needed a
man. It was
victory,
about very
especially
different
now
stuff.
that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day! A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my god!
No way.
That's right. The North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars.
No
And in them, they saw that Lee had
fucking way.
split up
That
forces.
reminds me of the army. When I was in the army, we had battle training for 1 week in the forest, and we had to make a map of our base and stuff, right? And I literally lost it, and I will never forget, man. It's the evening, and we're all eating around a campfire, and the big boss, the big Oberleutnant Hartzendorf, he came into the camp. He was a fucking monster, man. Pure fucking Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he's like, "Men, you are all dead." And like, what? Well, one of you motherfuckers. No, he said, "Everybody, please show me the maps of the camp." So everybody gets the maps out, right? And I'm like, And then he said, well, you're all dead. Private K has lost the map and the enemy got the map. And I'm like, oh, that sucks, man. That was funny.
McClellan headed out from
I was
DC,
laughing.
and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam.
Back to clean dishes.
A crucial battle
Kinda.
that would decide
But after that, they
the
brought
war.
me to the
It saw the most vicious fighting to
Union.
date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history.
Wow.
But for once, the North came out
the single
victorious,
bloodiest day in
and
American
Lee
history.
was forced to retreat.
Crazy.
He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy, old pal? You're fired. The North had won their crucial victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to
Very
end
clever. Well
slavery.
played, man.
An
Big
outraged
political play.
Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. Now, it was about creating a new Union. As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his army.
It seems really historically, if you are a general in a war and you do very well, you have a very good chance of becoming president after that.
Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south.
Grant became president. That's kind of what it
Having
said.
given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President. Option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general. Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside, and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south. Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey, Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, Rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey, God, whose side are you on? Ow. Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught.
Also, what a meat
Even the
grind this war
Confederates
was.
couldn't believe.
I always wonder when I look at the doctrines of this war, couldn't these generals just have modernized warfare and look for cover? Like stop running in like an idiot and actually
what they were seeing.
use
And
cover,
in one moment
maybe?
of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded.
Aw.
Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my, here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence. Or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City with enraged mobs.
Crazy that Lincoln held it all together, man.
For slaves,
It really doesn't
an
look
idea
good.
that many of them simply did
pizza.
not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist.
And they made the first black regiment,
knowing
right?
they were fighting for, signed up. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fellow.
Thank you, man.
General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again, Lincoln ordered him to move
There's a
south
movie about them?
and take Richmond.
What is the movie's name?
Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men.
When is Gettysburg
Lee
happening?
was forced to defy all military convention. He had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire.
Ah, fucking idiots.
You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. It was yet another loss, and Northern support
Crazy, man. How did the North win this
waver.
shit, man?
While the Union kept on struggling in the East, out West, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi.
Like steampunk
Aware
shit.
that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's
And I always think about this. Imagine Ulysses S. Grant would have never been born. Imagine he would have died in a accident or something, man. Entire human history will change, man. I think it's so interesting that the butterfly effect, how these small things in history have massive changes, man. That shit interesting.
From Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything in the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot?
Nice.
So General
beard,
Snapping
bro.
Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily. But as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling.
Oh, and economy
Riots
wins
broke out
wars,
in the
man.
streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got. And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself.
Imagine seeing this in real life,
were
man.
forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. Joseph, what are you doing? I'm not gonna let them take my beans.
Historical facts,
How many
man.
times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans? By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield.
Wow.
Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left. But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union...
Imagine you guys know me, right? Imagine. I always try to imagine things, man, because you know, creative brain and stuff. But could you imagine? God, I want to stop using that word. What it must feel like to bayonet charge down there? Like, you must be on so much adrenaline, bro. You must just be terrified, but also you're like ready.
On the final day, so we decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia.
That's alpha, man. He told them it's his fault.
Just managed to score a massive victory. And
could you imagine Putin doing this?
And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular
Kansas.
saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga and ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe...
Yeah, as always, in every war, the biggest losers are the soldiers, man. They just want to hang out. They don't have any political agenda, man. They just want to live life, man.
Honey, the siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses. For those who had given their lives, a new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. Well,
damn, what a man. I have so much respect for this shit.
They were now making progress.
Crazy,
the North
crazy.
still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East. And that was bad news for Lincoln, because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates...
Oh, they have elections during wars? There should like be a law that if there's a war, you don't have no elections or some shit.
And with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed
if the war
a
would
victory.
end like this.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest
look at that Chad. Bruh. If I would meet this guy at night, he's gonna fuck me. He's gonna fuck me
yet
up.
highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman
that guy
dominated.
Formed the KKK? No fucking way. He was really evil.
And pushed Johnson back to the city, but he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new.
Forrest Gump was named
As
after
Grant
him.
began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy...
That guy is an ancestor of Forrest Gump? Mind blown.
Hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. Jeez. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee. Again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. In D.C., Grant was criticized for being a butcher.
Dude,
at the Battle of the Wilderness, the
that's
Union
like Ukraine,
casualties
Russia
were
numbers,
so heavy
man,
that
in
Grant
just 6
reportedly
weeks.
began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital
just flanking
and
the whole
cut its
time, dude.
supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C., with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby?
No
I'm back.
way.
That's right. General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln.
What a fucking
my
cunt,
fellow
man.
countrymen. If you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war. Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however,
He must have been destroyed completely in the
including
voting.
McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe.
And that's why I get the arguments, man, but you shouldn't have elections in wartime, man, because you literally destabilize the country, you destabilize the logistic head of the whole war. That seems, I don't know, man. And I know you have this argument, but the president just could do the war forever. Come on.
Because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln
80%.
had won with an electoral college landslide,
fucking
with
wrecked,
the troops
man.
in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't
Well, imagine how he must felt like when he got the message that he got 91%.
lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later,
What a moment
at
that
his
must have
second
been.
inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds.
Imagine an American president actually advocating for unification of the country. Imagine that, bro. Like, dude.
To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification. John Wilkes Booth, an actor living in D.C., was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate,
was an
he
Assassin's
was
Creed
already
Templar or
plotting
something,
his
right?
revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses.
What does that mean?
Sherman decided to do something unprecedented.
What are you gonna
He would
do?
remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines.
Ah, that's
They
not good,
also
man.
liberated
That
thousands
is- that
of
means-
slaves. The damage
That's good
done
though.
was
Oh,
as
imagine you're a slave and suddenly they come in and liberate you, man. But this is 1.4 billion in damage from. Oh, wow, holy crap! They must have had a good time, but you're gonna get a lot of resentment after the war, right? These
estimated
people will
at
never forget what you did to
$1.4
them.
billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burnt out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to
Sherman
hear
is
it.
very despised himself. Makes sense though. They named the Sherman tank after him.
Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier.
No fucking way.
Wilmer McLean.
No way. That is not real.
All right,
Wow.
can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now! I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the
Back
time
then, there was a
for
lot of respect,
reconciliation.
man.
Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson
shooting
would surrender to
fucking
Sherman,
rockets
ending
in
the war
civilian
for
houses all the time.
89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a
That
speech
house
from the
literally in
White
the
House
Sesame
to a
Tree?
jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency
He allowed
visibly
Lee to keep his
aged.
saber.
He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, I think I am the tiredest man on earth. I'm not sure tiredest
Lee was
is a
related
word,
to
but
George
geez,
Washington.
the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly
What a
into the
cunt.
president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise. The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued
What did Lee
into
do
May,
after the war?
when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began.
Crazy that still nowadays in 2022 these guys are voting Republican. They're still a bit more racist than the North. Like there's still an echo of this time, right? Felt nowadays. Crazy actually.
Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the
man.
bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, but the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners
He
were
led the
those
university.
who were to never again be slaves. Gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However,
He became the
entering
headmaster of
into the
Washington
20th
University and
century,
became an
it
advocate
was
for
clear
equal
the fight
rights.
for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up.
In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. I feel like if I was American, I would cry right now, man. You Americans, man, you have such a rich culture, such a history, man. You guys have so much potential, man. And it's, as always, man, my message to American viewers is it's very sad what is happening to your country with all that division, man. You guys, if you will just work together, you will rule the world, man. But I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat.
In the
You guys
darkest
could
of
be so much
times,
more.
stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has
Germany's
forged
history too, but
America
it's illegal.
and what it should ever strive to
America
be.
has a very rich culture, man. You guys always talk so much shit, man.
What are you still doing here, mate? Jeez. Well, if you want to see more, click these videos. Have fun. Looking good, boy.